Cool, okay. No practicing. Don't worry about it. This presentation is called Deviant Sexualities in Elden Ring, Part 1. Mohg, Lord of Blood, by Enemy Charlie. And essentially what I'm going to be do is, talk about Mohg as a, vampire narrative. Anyway. Alright, so the classic vampire narrative, is typically one about moral contamination of some kind. In the sense that when a vampire makes someone else a vampire, they go out and they kill, they murder, obviously they do immoral things. So we have quotes here from Vampire Religion. A vampire becomes hard and cruel and sensual in the same way that one contracts rabies or AIDS, a result of nothing but an exchange of infectiously contaminated bodily fluids by which the victim is tainted, and is in turn rendered morally dangerous as a carrier of perversion to all other people. And Mohg, I think, is very obviously meant to resemble a sort of vampire. He is the Lord of Blood, obviously, and one becomes a bloody finger when they are injected with his vampire blood. And then they begin to hunt down their fellow tarnished, such as Yura here, who is trying to stop Bloody Finger Eleonora. And says, please, please, Eleonora, yield to the cessplood no longer. Do not stain the immaculacy of your sword, your flesh, your fire. And here is Dracula from Bram Stoker's Dracula, the movie, not the book. I mean, based off the book, obviously. But yeah, essentially, vampirism is like, it's moral contamination. It reflects anxieties about moral contamination. And generally, these take various shapes. The first, which I think is probably the most relevant to today, would be homosexuality, the contamination of homosexuality. I want to make sure you guys can see these GIFs. You can. Anyway, this is again from Bram Stoker's Dracula. And this is Dracula caressing a very beautiful young Keanu Reeves. Shaving him and then licking his blood off of the shaving. So I'm going to read here from Vampires, Anxieties, and Dreams, Race and Sex in the Contemporary United States. In classic vampire stories, the moment of transubstantiation, the blood-sucking ritual that will either kill the victim or initiate him/her into the realm of the undead, often violates and enacts one of the greatest taboos of this straight white male mythology. The male vampire, with greedy lust in his eyes, leans in to take his victim's blood, a thinly veiled act of penetration. In the cinematic telling of this moment, the camera often shifts the perspective of the victim so that the viewer becomes a victim being taken and penetrated by these male lustful eyes. So essentially, vampires, incite anxieties around homosexuality. Again, here we can see we are obviously identifying with the frightened and afraid, beautiful young Keanu Reeves, who is being caressed, not penetrated in the sense, but, would be penetrated with the fangs and emasculated. And that does occur in Elden Ring. The way in which someone receives the blessing of Mohg is being injected with his blood, so being penetrated with a needle and filled with his fluids, and given a disease, a corruption of sorts, sort of like HIV. And again, this is based off of like cultural homophobia and whatnot. The seductive aspect of vampires is central to them as well, because the drinking of blood is a very lusty thing. It's associated with the flesh, the pleasures of the flesh, and Vare kind of acts as our seduction, our homoerotic seduction into Mohg's vampirism. So this is Vampire Seduction, The Vicissitudes of Masculine Identity in Bram Stoker's Dracula by Dejan Kuzmanovich, where he posits that seduction stages a contained, controlled crisis of the subject's identity and enables the resolution of that crisis and the reconsolidation of that identity. In this way, the subject's ego is constantly reestablished in the ways necessitated by that subject's circumstances, while the nature of the specific crisis depends on the culturally available anxieties of the moment. So essentially, seduction is about threatening one's identity and ego, but being able to reclaim it. And generally, this identity is threatened through cultural anxieties. And in this case, in this day and age specifically, homosexuality is a huge cultural anxiety. And so Kuzmanovich goes on to say, while the vampire's shape-shifting presence, baffling, elusive, indefinable, threatens to pry open the victim's ego and actually, before I read that, I'm going to talk about Vare's seduction. We have here, this is his bouquet item. He says, this weapon reflects white mask Vare's manner of speech rather well, enticing in its splendor, but full of deadly consequence. He also speaks very seductively. He says, I knew from the very start you have a taste for noble blood. And it isn't just me being into Vare. It is not just me being into Vare. But he does. He seduces us into, you know, taking the blood of Luminary Mohg. He promises power. He promises love. He promises strength, vision. He calls us his little lambkin, which is rather suggestive. He says that we have the sweetest screams. He seduces us and he penetrates us. He fills us with the corrupted blood. But now I'm going to read this quote. So, while the vampire's shape-shifting presence, baffling, elusive, indefinable, threatens to pry open the victim's ego and enforce its exposure to unconscious desires and anxieties, thus exposing the indeterminacy of ego-forming structures such as gender and sexual orientation, the imaginary unified image of the vampire as a knowable, diagnosable, and therefore destroyable monster is a defensive mechanism by means of which the victim's ego protects itself against the disruptive forces of its own unconscious. Through the fantasy of a coherent monstrous self, the other without, and through the drama of being temporarily... What? Shut up, username. The fantasy of a coherent monstrous self, the other without, and through the drama of being temporarily vulnerable to its monstrous seductiveness, the victim's ego distracts itself, as it were, from the encounter with the unconscious, the other within, and thus the victim is ultimately able to detach itself from the monstrous desire to yield to the vampire's seduction. In this sense, meaning that because Vare is portrayed as obviously vile and despicable, gross, he encourages us to do immoral things. Though he seduces us, we are able to detach ourselves from him because he's bad. And eventually we kill him, and he dies saying, "Bless the Mohgwyn dynasty with love." But I think furthermore, if we're talking about... Okay, guys, can you please stop adding me unless it's something that has to do with the presentation? Thank you. So then we're going to talk about... another way in which this cultural anxiety around homophobia is established. I need to move my little webcam. Is through the image of the child. So obviously we know that Mohg kidnaps Mikola and kind of fulfills this archetype of the predatory queer man. So we have Gideon here saying the Halig tree, now but a husk. I heard speculation Mikola embedded himself in the Halig tree, but before he could finish, someone cut the tree open and absconded with his infant form. Now, Mikola is rather stuck in this immortal form of a child. And then, wishing to raise Mikola to full godhood, Mohg wished to become his consort, taking the role of monarch. But no matter how much of his bloody bedchamber he tried to share, he received no response from the young Empyrean. So, in essence, Mohg has kidnapped Mikola and has set out to make him his boy wife, thus invoking the image of the child, which Lee Pace and No Future, Queer Theory, and the Death Drive defines as the child has come to embody for us the telos, the social order, and come to be seen as the one for whom that order is held in perpetual trust. The child marks the fetishistic fixation of heteronormativity, an erotically charged investment in the rigid sameness of identity that is central to the compulsory narrative of reproductive futurism. What this means essentially is not literal children, but this cultural image of the child, this symbol of our future, this thing that must be protected, and of reproduction, essentially, a reproductive future. That's why, usually, the image of the child is used to hurt queer people, LGBT people. Pace goes on to say, the lives, the speech, and the freedoms of queer adults face constant threat of legal curtailment out of deference to imaginary children whose future, as if they were permitted to have them except as they consist in the prospects of passing them down onto children of their own, are construed as endangered by the social disease as which queer sexualities register. So, in essence, Mohg's kidnapping of Mikola is, as many have rightfully recognized, is meant to be creepy and uncomfortable. It's meant to invoke the image of the evil queer pedophile come to corrupt and take away the children, the future. And then Winnibus goes on to say, the vampire moment of transubstantiation ushers in a radical shift in the Western ontology of reproduction. So there's the ways in which vampire reproduction occurs is outside the norm, and thus causes anxiety. And as in Elden Ring, as we discussed in my Grotesque Divinities presentation, reproduction and control of reproduction is of key importance in the Lands Between, to the point that things that fall outside of that reproductive norm, which is burial through the roots of the Earth Tree and being reborn through it, are reviled and hated. There's also, and I'm actually don't know if I'm going to present on this one, whatever. Another sort of cultural anxiety that manifests with vampirism is the fear of tainted blood. And I use this art right here because I wanted to point something out. We have the white blonde Mikola, who is being touched, encased, and stolen by these dark hands. So when moral depravity is figured as disease like transmissible contamination, it signifies in the latter-day context one or another panicky ideology based on shunning the unclean, on policies of segregation and social cleansing, on the worship of purity of blood. And Winnibus posits that, like, generally the mixing of blood is based on the fear of the other, and actually defines it as inverting the racist one-drop rule, whereby the sexual act must be vigilantly protected as a purely white act. The gift of immortality is located in the intentional mixing of blood. So around the Victorian era, when kind of scientific racism was at its zenith, which still does occur today with people having tons of anxiety and fears around race mixing, vampirism, or the sense that someone could be corrupted or changed biologically, does represent those fears of essentially race mixing the other. And Mohg, in the sense, I'm not saying Mohg is meant to be a person of color, but generally that I want to turn towards Dr. Ebony Elizabeth's paper called Toward a Theory of the Dark Fantastic, the Role of Racial Difference in Young Adult Speculative Fiction Media. She presents this theory of the dark other, which is the embodied darkness that is the primary locus of alterity in the fantastic, which generally appears in monstrous, shadowy shapes to signify the other, and that it is intentionally, that these figures are intentionally actually dark in nature, and that this is generally a racialized difference. And so Mohg, whose blood is cursed in comparison to this, blonde, pure Empyrean, is bringing up fears of, like, race mixing, essentially. Mohg invokes the fear of, in essence, with our more, I suppose, moral contaminations that would be more relevant to modern audiences, Mohg invokes homophobia and racism through vampirism. But older anxieties around moral contamination from vampires comes from paganism. So the vampire is above all an emanation of the world of superstition, an image of a terrible menace posed by the superstitious mentality to decent Christian existence. So the vampire and its the partaking of blood brings to mind rather these pagan rites, like this pagan past in Europe, and awful rituals that the Victorians believe committed. Krampus is here, sneaky, I saw that, because he kind of resembles Mohg, but also because Krampus was a, supposedly, God, he wouldn't be a cryptid, but a figure out of folklore, pagan folklore, that continued on today. And so Mohg himself and the worship of Mohg is reviled, because born partially of devolution, it was considered, he's an omen. He is a sign of devolution, the time of the crucible, the pagan times. He's a sign of impurity, though it was once considered divine. So you might be saying, well, no one wants Mohg to be in charge because he's bad and kills people, etc. But I'd like to add that the Dung Eater sees grace. He has the grace of the Erd Tree. So the world that the Dung Eater wants is acceptable to the Greater Will as long as it heals the Elden Ring. The world Mohg wants is not acceptable, not because it's violent, bloody, bad, but because it's under the Formless Mother rather than the Greater Will. So, paganism. Vampirism brings up fears of paganism. But there is also, vampires are kind of evocative of this like lurking pagan menace. And now around the time that Bram Stoker was writing Dracula, which was essentially probably the most famous vampire novel, there was a ton of anxiety in Victorian England about, as James Fraser in 1890 in his novel called The Golden Bough describes, Christian Europe at the threshold of the new century is menaced by a possibly volcanic upsurge of a latent superstitious mentality that has never, despite all efforts, been successfully extirpated from the modern world. A solid level of savagery remains, he says, beneath the surface of society and poses a standing menace to civilization. We seem to move on a thin crust which may at any moment be rent by the subterranean forces slumbering below. But essentially, this deep, deep fear that Europe's pagan past still lies beneath its Christian one, just waiting to corrupt it. The fear that those seeds of evil paganness are within modern, or at the time, Victorian Christian practices. And here I have, but Mohg's rune is soaked in accursed blood from his devout love for the wretched mire that he was born into far below the earth. This doesn't have a lot to do with it. I just thought it was interesting that he's, you know, the wretched mire is below the earth, and then the slumbering pagan past below the earth, ready to explode out into the open. And I want to talk about the basis of this, because in fact, Christianity does have a lot of very pagan vampiric practices. The most popular one, of course, and I'm so sorry for the blasphemy. I apologize. So currently, as we know, the most popular, as Herbert talks about, Christians undergo the same baptismal experience, of course. They are washed in the blood of the Lamb, and they drink his miraculous blood, the elixir of immortality, in the sacrament of the Eucharist. I don't know how to say it. But essentially, you know, although it is only symbolic, it is commonplace in the various branches of Christian religion, of which I practiced as a child, to take in and ingest the blood of Christ and the body of Christ. Eucharist. Thank you, Dramos. So this was causing quite a bit of anxiety around this time in Victorian England. There were these hymns that were especially popular, composed by John and Charles Wesley, that went around, that a lot of people began to kind of talk poorly about. And this hymn says, it's a religious hymn, we thirst to drink thy precious blood, we languish in thy wounds to rest, and hunger for immortal food, and long on all thy love to feast. Which obviously it's symbolic, but I mean, this is very vampiric in essence. However, there is a potential basis for actual vampiric Christian practices. So this comes from Christian author Epiphanius of Cyprus, and I found this quoted by Robert Louis Wilkham in The Christians of the Roman Saw Them. Really cool book, by the way. And this would be around like 100, 200 CE, so very early after Christ's death. And this was on the religious practices of early Christian fringe group. And I bring up that he's a Christian author because I want to emphasize that this is not Romans making stuff up, but these are Christians discussing other Christian fringe groups. So he says here that the woman and the man take the fluid of the emission of the man into their hands and say, we offer to thee this gift, the body of Christ. And then they eat it. Oh, I made a spelling mistake. They eat it, their own ugliness, and say, this is the body of Christ, and this is the Passover for the sake of which our bodies suffer, and are forced to confess the suffering of Christ. Similarly, also with the woman, when she happens to be in the flowing of the blood, they gather the blood of menstruation of our uncleanness, and eat it together, and say, this is the blood of Christ. So there are recorded instances in which Christians engaged in sexual rituals. That's what they're talking about. The emissions of the man is that they're talking about sex rituals where they eat semen. But also drinking blood. Of course, the Romans embellished upon this a lot and said that like Christians were drinking the blood of like children and stuff. But there was in fact some vampiric practices. So essentially the fear of, you know, Christianity having a and Christian societies having a sort of pagan you know, uncivilized roots to them are true. And I'm arguing that that is essentially what Mohg represents, rather than being this rather offensive figure meant to invoke fears of queer people, of race mixing. I think that he's meant to point out the hypocrisies of the Golden Order. Because the Golden Order and the Erd Tree itself is essentially vampiric. So Erd Tree burial is the practice of people being buried in the roots of the Erd Tree, where they are essentially sucked up through the boughs, used as its life force, and then spat out into the earth. People also ingest the, you know, to keep ourselves alive, we ingest the tears of the Erd Tree, the tears of life, to keep ourselves alive. And we are also made immortal by the Erd Tree. As people are made immortal by vampiric practices, we are made immortal. But it's not described as a good thing, and this comes from the noble sorceress Ashes. But abandoning their birthplace after the shattering, these undead beings are the pitiful product of unending life. They are most commonly found struggling to maintain balance while roaming the fields of the lands between. Surely they were in search of something once, but whatever it was has long been forgotten. So the vampiric Golden Order has essentially leached the life out of the people of the lands between, and turn them into husks. They're surviving off of the life force. It's vampiric. And I also think that if we think about Mohg and his corrupted body, I didn't add this and I just thought about this. Mohg's corrupted body. I mean, Marika herself and is also a corrupted body. I mean, she's merged herself with Radagon and created children through incestuous rituals, presumably. Self-cestuous, so an even deeper degree of incest, I suppose, if you are to make a child with oneself, which has resulted in Mikla being forever a child and Melania being cursed with rot. So an even deeper degree of depravity in their sexuality and of corruption of the body, because they're two people. So in essence, I think that Mohg, being a vampire, kind of reading him as a vampire, and reading the whole Mohgwyn dynasty thing as, you know, fear of moral contamination, I think reveals the hypocrisy of the Golden Order. And that's it! That's all I've got. Sorry if that made no sense.